podcast where we share stories and strategies from the game's most fascinating minds. No matter where you are in your poker journey, there's always something new to learn. So let's get right into this week's episode.
Welcome back to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm Zach Shaw, here as always with James Split Suit Sweeney. How are you doing, sir?
Not too bad. How are you?
Doing all right and ready to get into another poker strategy podcast. This time, James, I need a pre-flop plan. I need a strategy. I need an easy to digest checklist that I can run through in the pre-flop stages of my game, which will waterfall into all the post-flop play and everything that I do. I want to get this right. What do you have for me?
So before I answer that, we will go into the entire checklist that I kind of suggest. Talk to me about what you do right this moment. So your pre-flop folds around to you. You're dealt whatever hand you happen to get dealt. What are you thinking about right that moment before you decide to raise, fold, or open limp? You're not open limping much, right?
No. I learned that from watching you. No.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking about a few things. I'm thinking about the players at the table and the position I am relative to them. Over the years, I've learned that keeping your eye on players who are especially weak players, but also strong players is important because you need to adjust to their tendencies. And I'm thinking about ranges. I'm thinking about, where I am at the table, what action has come before me, and sort of trying to visualize in my head that range chart of which hands I should be opening. And after time, it's become a little intuitive. I'd say beyond that, those are my main thoughts, and I probably should be thinking about a little bit more than that.
So, you're thinking about pretty decent stuff right off the bat, right? So if we let's just go through the entire checklist first. And I think you actually hit most of them pretty darn well. So do you have the list in front of you, or should I bring it up? Okay, so why don't you run us through, there's 6 of them. Let's run through all of them. We're kind of take them step by step after we go through all 6.
Okay. Well, the acronym here that we're using to organize these concepts is PLANES. And real quick, that's position, location of weaker players, aggression, no limit, edges and EV, SPR. You might not know what all that means, but we'll get to it in a second. Starting with position, which is sort of the cardinal strategic element in poker, right? It's one of the first things we teach in core, the importance of position and how it changes the way we play. So what are your thoughts on considering position in pre-flop?
So, the bare bones basic is this, right? The closer you are to the button, the fewer players that are left to act after you, the more aggressive you want to be, the more hands you want to be playing. And conversely, when there are a lot more players between yourself and picking up the pot uncontested pre-flop, aka when you're in early position or earlier middle position, then you just play less hands from those spots simply because it's just not going to be as good for you. Again, less chance that you're able to pick up the pot uncontested pre-flop. And if you do end up getting action, right, if you raise from early position, if you get action, there's a decent chance that you're going to be out of position going post-flop, and that sucks. Whereas if you raise on the button or you play a hand on the button, even by calling a raise, you're going to be in position going post-flop, and that's going to be far, far better. So if nothing else, always make sure you're at least keeping that in mind, and that will keep you kind of sane, right? So if you go look at your early position raising ranges or your middle position calling ranges, and you're like, wait, I'm playing a lot of hands from here, that's probably like one of the easiest things you can do right now to fix your pre-flop game, right? Because if you fix that, you're getting involved in better spots by just simply getting rid of the bad ones. And that way you're going to find yourself out of position less often in junky post-flop spots with hands that probably shouldn't have been played in the first place, which makes your life easier and also more profitable. And that's worthwhile at the end of the day as far as I'm concerned.
True. And, can I ask you a position-related question?
Sure.
When I'm sitting at the table, or let me ask you in context, when you're sitting at the table and you've played with the players at your table for a few hours and you kind of have a beat on them, do you treat every position as sort of a unique combination of things going on? And what I mean by that is I find myself often in a spot where some of the players at the table understand that, for example, if it limps to me or folds to me on the button and I raise, that I could be stealing or I could, have a really wide range. Whereas other players don't notice this at all and might themselves, fold the button every time it folds to them. And so I'm always trying to balance how, different, play styles and levels of play can kind of change in each position as the positions change for the other players.
Yeah, so I think that's a major important thing to consider as you're getting kind of past the basics, right? So you want to think about how your opponents are going to react in those positions, which is exactly what you're considering. Are they going to defend their button a lot? Are they going to be three betting from the blinds a lot, thinking that I'm stealing and they think they can re-steal me profitably, those kind of things? Or are they just going to play really static range? And let's be honest, most people that you're playing against, especially in like smaller live games or more micro online games, are playing more of a static range of hands. They say, these are the hands I'm going to play, and here's how I'm probably going to play them, and everything else is just going to get folded. Which, okay, it's simple, it's easy, and if you're multi-tabling, like, that makes a lot of sense. Or if you just don't want to think about the game at like a super in-depth way, that makes sense. I get that. But for the rest of us, and when we're playing against players who are thinking at a deeper level, we definitely want to think about that, which means also that you can get away with things that you probably may not even realize. For instance, if you're playing at a table where like nobody messes with the early position opener, especially if, let's say, the early position opener opens to an atypically large size. Well, if that's the case, could you treat early position as a steal position? Probably. Right? But most people will never consider that. So again, this is why you kind of do some of this off-table thought process, kind of play with it, think about how your opponents would react. What does that do? Is that good? Is that bad? If you get a caller, if you get a three better, what does that do? And what's the probability of those things happening, right? If everyone's going to fold a large chunk of the time, maybe you can actually find early position steals. It's not trying to get lost in playing super static and sticking to preflop charts. Preflop charts are great. We have preflop charts at Redshift as well. But there are plenty of times to deviate from that. And by thinking about planes, we're just on position now, but what you're kind of edging in towards is more of that E, talking about edges especially, then all of a sudden you can start finding ways where you can add more hands or spots where you should be deleting more hands. Just getting totally static and can definitely miss a win rate along the way, like tons of it, if I'm being totally honest.
Yeah. And I'm noticing now as we talk about it, all of these concepts within the planes checklist are very interrelated and touch upon each other. And what we're talking about, the location of weaker players, the L in planes. Why is that so high up on the list?
So this list isn't ordered in importance. I suppose it could be, but it wasn't done that way specifically. But location of weaker players keeps you very focused on where the fish are. Or just as importantly, where the fish aren't, right? So if there's a fish that's to your right and they fold in early position and now there's no more fish left behind you and you're in early or middle, well, that's not as great for you. But if you're in middle position and there's a fish in the blind, well, all of a sudden that's extremely good for you. If there are very aggressive three betters somewhere, and whether they're good three betters or fishy three betters, doesn't matter. Like, you have to be very cognizant of these things. So it's more thinking about location of where are people and what are they likely to do, which is actually kind of more to your point of what you just brought up in the previous example. So who are they? How are they likely to react? Are they likely to fold more because you're doing X, Y, or Z and they're in X, Y, or Z position? Are they likely to call more? And the better a player is, the more they're thinking about also where are the other fish? Where are the squeezers? Right? So if a good player calls and there's a lot of players left after them and one of them is a notorious squeezer, what are they calling with? Are they going to put more aces and kings into their flatting range in order to try to induce that squeezer? Maybe, and that's a very real possibility, and you need to think about that if that pot ends up getting squeezed and you're sitting there with one of those more marginal hands and you don't really want to end up getting back raised. So these are all considerations, but especially if you stay focused on where are the fish and could you ever get them heads up to yourself, that's going to be a very good thing. And that's the important thing, right? That's one of those spots where you might open even a little bit wider from early or middle position if the rest of the table is a little bit on the nittier side and there's a single fish in the blinds, because you'd have position on them if you end up going post flop. That's great. And you're going to have a massive edge against them because they're fishy, and that's great as well. So all of a sudden, those cuspy hands that you would have otherwise folded normally can actually end up getting raised here because you're putting yourself into a great profitable situation. You're not going to win it 100% of the time, but you're going to win it plenty enough and win plenty enough the times you do win to justify getting involved.
All right. Yeah, the L really reminds me, if I had a visualization of it, of that scene in Rounders where Matt Damon and the pros are sitting around the table at the casino, and the fish sit down, have that montage of all the different fish sitting down and how, they don't know. And that's something that I think every poker player who's played enough poker has experienced, that you're sitting around the table, talking, and then all of a sudden you see someone sit down and you profile them just on the way they look. And I wanted to note, that I used to exploit this a lot. I would try and go to the casino, dress up real young and like rock and rolly, just try and look as much not like a poker player as I could, so that when I sat down, people would profile me as a total fish. And, I don't think I'm a total fish. I might not be the greatest player in the world, but I would often get certain kinds of actions against me just based on my profile. So you can't judge a book by its cover, but, the action dictates who a weak player is, right?
Yeah, and you're definitely not a total fish, but to add just a little bit more to that, is anyone who's thinking is not going to be fooled for very long. Because if you're competent at this game, there are certain things you do, and just as importantly, don't do, that make it very clear that you know what you're doing. Whereas fishy players, when you see that 3-bet get sized in such a way, when you see the calls being done in spots where you're like, you really shouldn't have much of a calling range here, dude. Like, you see things and you're like, okay, that person just can't be good. So if you are competent, better competent players at the table will figure it out pretty darn quickly. So you're not fooling too many people, and the ones you are fooling, probably not going to fool them for too long anyway.
Yeah, that's why I stopped doing that. I mean, I still dress like a freak sometimes, but that's just for my own pleasure now. The A on this list, I wanted some clarification on that. It's aggression, and I'm going to state what I'm thinking of, and maybe you can correct me. Like, I don't think about aggression pre-flop that much. This is one of the things I didn't mention, and I feel like I could be doing more to really, aggression, I would assume, is a little bit of post-flop planning too. Like, if you're going to be aggressive pre-flop, how are you going to follow that up? Are you going to be barreling later? Are we thinking that far ahead, or are you more narrow to just pre-flop with aggression?
So this is one where you should be thinking multiple steps ahead, especially if there's things that you know are going to happen a large chunk of the time, right? If you know that someone is going to raise a lot or 3-bet a lot or call a lot and you're likely to go heads up, like these are all things that you can plan for. Again, if you suspect that they're going to happen at a pretty large chunk, right? So when you have fishier players that just have to see most flops, chances are you're going to get called a lot, which means you should actually probably already be thinking about the flop, if not the barrel, and will that be good or bad? Now, typically I try to think 2 streets ahead. But that's very, very difficult if you haven't played a lot or you're still working on this game between sessions, no problem. But if you can at least think a step ahead in your aggression, that can be extremely helpful. Again, especially if you're like, okay, this dude's fishy, he's going to call a ton of the time. And again, we're right back to where are the fish at the table. Then you can say, okay, well, I'm likely going to get called here, which means I need to think, okay, when I have whatever hand you have here, say it's King 10 suited, how am I going to be c-betting? Am I going to c-bet my whiffs? Am I going to c-bet really just for value? And how am I going to be playing my draws? Am I more likely to check raise them or not? At least by thinking that step ahead, you don't even have to be like totally solid in it. At least by thinking about that, you can keep yourself from making like massive blunders. Because what happens is a lot of people don't think that step ahead. And let's just take a spot where, like, say there's a raise in front and you're thinking about calling. Well, okay, if you just say, okay, if we go heads up, do I think my opponent's going to c-bet a ton of the time? Because if you can at least think that step ahead, then you can say, okay, I'm probably not going to fold 100% of the time when I end up facing that c-bet. Maybe I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to raise more often when they c-bet this spot. Or I'm going to just, float this out one time and play turns really, really face forward because I think they're going to play it even more face forward. Just, again, all things that came about just by asking the question of what do I think is going to happen next? And you could do that same thing when you're thinking about 3-betting, right? If I were to 3-bet, what do I think is going to happen next? Do I think they're going to fold a lot? Do I think they're going to 4-bet a lot? Do I think they're going to call a lot? And if they do call, how do I think they're going to play flops? So again, you don't even have to be like rock solid in it. But the more times you ask yourself these questions, you're like, I don't really know. Well, write that question down and go explore that spot in Flopzilla when you get home. Or explore it the next day, whatever. But if you don't do that kind of work, it'll be infinitely more difficult to try to think ahead in any reasonable context. So if you're stuck right now and you're like, I don't even know how the heck I could think that far ahead, that's okay. You get there with time, but do this kind of study and exploration. That way you get better at saying, oh, this is how I beat someone who's going to c-bet too often because I think they're going to do that. Or check fold too often, which means I can probably add more calls into my in-position calling range against them pre-flop, those kind of things. So yes, proactivity is very, very beneficial. Whether you're thinking about taking aggressive lines or passive lines pre-flop, doesn't matter. Just be proactive. And if it's just a street ahead or an action ahead, that's fine. It's a great start. It's far better than nothing.
Yeah, and to me, that's one of the most fun parts of poker, especially as you've been playing for a while and studied a bit. it's almost a sub game to kind of figure out people's patterns and tendencies and, your plans. I know one guy in our home game, he opened very wide or would call very wide rather in position. So he basically called any raise in position, and then would play pretty solid post flop. He had a good balance of, value to bluff. But he would always pounce on weakness basically. So I found myself essentially, doing the opposite thing where I would check raise anything that was decent and bet out things that were more marginal. Cause he was also kind of, if I bet out on the flop out of position, he would interpret that as strength. And so I definitely got a leg up on him for a while, but I think he's adjusted since.
Well, so let's actually bring that up because I think that's a totally fair example. So let's just say you're playing against a player like that. You have a couple different ways that you personally can adjust. You can play tighter preflop to try to find yourself in less awkward post-flop spots where your range is a little bit stronger and you're going to have a fewer marginal decisions. Not that all of a sudden post-flop becomes, 100% automatic, but it becomes a little bit easier when you wash out some of the weaker stuff in your preflop opening range. But then your other thing is you said, okay, I'm going to start check raising my decent hands. I would actually throw it the other way and say, I'm actually going to start check raising like pretty much all of my air until I think he adjusts properly. Because if he's calling with so many hands pre-flop, inherently he's going to miss a ton of the time on the flop. And if he always pounces on aggression, that means most of his betting range on the flop, or be it on a turn, whichever street you think is most applicable to this, he's probably going to be super, super wide. And he's probably going to fold a ton of the time when you check raise, at least for the first, handful of them. And if you can get a couple of those in per night, I mean, that is just super, super easy money. And it's not even that much risk. And you just make your bluff super, super profitable. So if you do go the other way first, where you decide to check raise your decent hands, ask yourself, is he actually continuing a lot of the time? Chances are he probably wasn't. So again, your brain forgets this because you're winning a small pot, and our brains are terrible when it comes to this kind of thing. Versus if you're constantly winning these small pots with your value hands, the first question you should ask is, wait, would they continue making those same folds if I had my bluff hands? If yes, maybe I just flip this entire thing upside down and make my check raise range super, super bluff heavy instead.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna try that. And as you described that, I could see that hole and could see maybe I'm also overestimating his bluffs, ratio of bluffs to value hands. That's the thing, right? Like, that's the trickiest thing down because you don't see the bluffs and you don't see the value hands on the river.
Right.
This is a guy that loves to play to showdown, and I've just won a lot of pots against him trying to play trappy and tricky, but I'll definitely take that into consideration.
Yeah, and go back and replay, the last 5 to 10 hands where you guys got involved and got to showdown, so you got to see his cards, and go back and replay the entire spot. And think about, okay, like what 2 hole cards did he show at showdown? Because if he won a pot with, 7-6 offsuit, well, pre-flop, they're calling like incredibly, incredibly wide. So that can be like your confirmer for the pre-flop ranges, but that alone doesn't inherently confirm anything for post-flop. So you have to go back and replay the entire thing. Think about, are they maybe continuing a little too liberally against flop check raises or against c-bets, whatever it is. But I would definitely suggest doing like, that's the great thing about playing in home games. Is you're playing against the same guys, which means, going through this kind of analysis is going to help a ton. Absolute ton.
Yeah, man, it's crazy. As we're talking about this, I'm replaying hands in my head, being like, wait a minute, I know what you were doing there. Yep. You're just hitting top pair on the flop and then, trying to bluff me off a better hand. Wow. All right. Well, if we ever have a home game again, I'll let you know how that goes.
There you go.
So moving on down the list of the Plains acronym, we have N, no limit. Now, what is this? We're playing no limit poker. What do we need to know about no limit?
This is more of a reminder. So if you think about the A in aggression as always at least consider what the aggressive option would do and try to be proactive in your aggressive planning, I think about N in the no limit sense of a reminder that you need to be thinking about your bet sizing and your raise sizing. And a lot of people get stuck in monkey see, monkey do. This is the typical raise size of this table, and as such, this is the only raise size I'm going to use. This is how the table 3-bets, and as such, this is my 3-bet size. This is how the table open raises. This is going to be my open raise size. And rinse repeat for every other bet size under the sun. But if you remind yourself that this is no limit, you have tons and tons of options available available to you, from egregiously small raise sizes to egregiously large raise sizes to just mashing it preflop as is. And again, you could use the same concept even for postflop. There are plenty of spots where different sizes can do really, really good things. And that goes for everything from like smaller 3-bets, where people are just still going to fold a ton of the time because they faced a 3-bet anyway. So you might be able to get even a good chunk of folds, whether you go a small size or a normal size. And if that's the case, then why not choose a smaller size? Why risk more if you don't have to? And you can also look at this when you're thinking about like isolating, right? If there's 2 limpers and you raise to maybe a normal 7 big blind size, well, what would happen if you raised to 10 big blinds instead? What about 12? What about 15? What about 20? And yes, these numbers can start to get very large, and maybe they're numbers that you're not even going to use. Maybe it's just a thought experiment more so than anything else, but it gets you thinking about the right things. Because the issue is people don't think about this stuff, either because they have other things they need to prioritize in their cognitive stack first, or they just haven't put enough off-table time in, or they're still working on experience, so they can't be thinking this far ahead. But if you're asking yourself about, okay, what are other size options that are available, you can find so many good spots. But if you don't ask yourself that, if you only say, okay, I have one size here, that's it, you're going to leave heaps and heaps of opportunity out there. And that goes for just picking up pots uncontested preflop, to finding extra value, to everything in between. So just don't forget, this is no limit. You got lots of size options available. If you at least start with saying, okay, here are 3 different sizes. Here's normal, here's a little smaller, here's a little bigger. Which one do I think is going to be better? Like, that question alone can help you a ton. You'll find so many extra spots. I promise you, it's not that difficult.
So that's kind of where I'm at in my game. I have sort of 3 sizes pre-flop, which would kind of be, one would be close, open raise size rather, closer to, the table standard, which is often at 1-2 games that I play, like $10,
Mm-hmm.
2 for every limper. And then sort of $15 is like the standard open raise, that you can put out all day. And then maybe a bigger, and again, +2 for each limber. And then a bigger size, like 20, 25, like blow them out of the pot size. And I find myself falling back on that $15 bet almost all the time. And then when I do apply the other bets, I don't really feel like I have a sound strategic reason behind it. It's more just like, oh, maybe, hey, I've got aces, so I'll raise smaller because, everyone's going to call, because I'm not going to do that. But I mean, like I make these decisions of like, or I would make it on a bigger bet, right? So like, oh, all these people are going to call whatever I bet. So let me bet like $25 with aces and build value.
And that's reasonable, right? So you're at least thinking, okay, what are my size options that are available? How do I think people are going to respond to them? And it sounds like you think in that spot where you have aces that everyone's going to be super inelastic. Doesn't matter if you raise to $12 or $25. Either way, they're still continuing. And in which case, when you have aces, why not just mash it for the maximum? That's total. What you just described there is like totally reasonable. The issue is that most people don't go there. They just say, okay, well, my average raise size is whatever size here. That's what I'm going to raise to. And it's like, well, again, it's not saying that that's awful. And I think that's a really important part of this is a lot of people forget, like, when we say that something is better, it doesn't inherently mean that every other plus EV play is terrible. It just means it's just not the best. And we're constantly focused on trying to optimize our plays, finding the play that is the absolute most profitable. And if you're not asking yourself what are some other sizes, you're never going to be able to find optimal. But think about what are sizes, what are they accomplishing? Is that good? Is that bad? And is there something available that would be better? Either risking a little bit more or risking a little bit less, and thinking about what that's really going to accomplish at the end of the day. And just take a light estimate of which one's going to be best, which actually brings us over to the E, thinking about EV. Kind of takes us right there.
Yeah, so edges and EV. What that's kind of vague, but I'm sure you're going to put a finer point on it right now.
Yeah, so the EV thing, again, is like thinking about what are your available lines and just taking a rough estimate of which one do you think is going to be best. Thinking about it from an EV perspective, what's the upside potential? What's the downside potential? How often do I think this is going to happen? Is this good? Is that bad? And again, you can use workbooks, you can use various tools for this kind of thing to get stronger with it, but you have to put in some time and effort to at least be able to eyeball it. And don't get me wrong, figuring out exact EV preflop is like nearly impossible. So you're just trying to take a rough eyeball of, do I think I'm putting myself in a terrible spot, a good spot, or a best spot? And figure out which one you think is going to work best for you. And again, the more time you put in stuff off table, the easier it gets to be able to eyeball that. And you're always going to be improving on this. You're never going to be done calculating this or figure out like a perfect formula. It's one of those, it just takes time. I mean, I guess if you're playing like super short stack tournaments or something where the decision tree is very, very minimal, fine. But when you're playing cash games with stack depth, like it's an ever moving benchmark. So don't stress yourself out about trying to find perfect plus EV or optimal everything. And then the edges part is thinking about where your edges are at the table. And for a lot of people, this is one that just kind of gets avoided. And it's not purely related to the location of fish, which is, again, the L. But this is also thinking about, like, is your edge going to be stronger if you 3-bet this person and get them heads up, or if you call and get them heads up preflop, right? And again, that kind of forces some proactivity. You need to be thinking about, what are your edges pre-flop? What are your edges post-flop? Do they do anything good, bad, or indifferent post-flop or pre-flop that you can exploit? And it's kind of taking you down that exploitative thought process, thinking about your skills and what skills you have, what your opponent is capable of, what your opponent's likely to do, and how you can best take advantage of that. This gets kind of wonky because there's like so many different ways and things that we should be looking at here. But at least if you say, okay, would this be a better spot for me to 3-bet and get him heads up, or call and play heads up post up? Which one's going to be better? Like, that alone, again, is proactive, and you're focused on the right stuff, which is going to help you craft your ranges pre-flop, which, again, makes your life easier.
Right. Yeah, these things are all interrelated, but edge seems to be something that kind of brings it all together into one easy to conceptualize thing at the table. And you can kind of build in people's frequencies and actions and weaknesses and how aggressive they are. What utility does that have? Do we have to be careful with that pre-flop of stereotyping someone based on what we've seen over a small sample size? Or should we really be taking that to heart because that's all the information we have to go on?
So there's always going to be a large margin of error, especially when you're playing live in player pools where, like, you don't play against the same people day in and day out. Like, you might be building some assumptions that's based upon 20 hands, which is not very much and not something I would suggest like setting your entire life on by any stretch. But we have to work with the information we have, and we have to do the best we can with it. I think another thing factored into this is a lot of people overestimate their own edges. They're like, oh yeah, no, I have a huge edge on this dude in like all pots. And like, maybe you do, but people overestimate their edge left, right, and center. I swear. It's like one of the worst things that you can do is to think that you are the best player at every single table that you sit at. I mean, even me, like, I still have to be like, I don't know, that dude might be better than me in like this pot if we go to like turns on these kind of textures. Like, maybe they are. And I have to be like really, really objective about that. Like, it's rare that I sit at a table and I don't feel like I'm number one, number two at that table. But even if I am number one or number two, it doesn't mean that I couldn't be bested in specific branches along the decision tree. Or maybe I'm going to make bigger mistakes in X pot, so maybe I'll take the alternative line instead. So be really, really objective and do your best to estimate this. I mean, this is, again, kind of going into like conceptual territory, and do your best to estimate these things. If nothing else, it keeps you focused on the right questions to ask yourself to make sure you're not missing massive things pre-flop. Because that's where people go wrong. They overestimate their own edges. They think they can get away with playing every single hand. They think they can just use really, really basic default sizing. Like, they're trying to like overly simplify the pre-flop strategy and also assume that they're going to be better than everyone 100% of the time. And like, those two things together, it's just like, no, like, you're going to do fine against fishy players, but that does not prepare you for moving up and playing against tougher people. Like, it's just not going to do it.
And it seems baked into poker from the day you start and you win your first big hand and you feel like, oh yeah, I really outsmarted them and won this spot. Yep. Maybe you have some perspective and see the luck in it, but I can't tell you how many players who really are beginners by all accounts think they could go heads up with Phil Ivey and have a shot,
But that's why this game exists, right? That's why this game continues to be profitable years and years later, even though you see like complete crushers that just crush this game over periods of time. And it's like, all right, clearly there's some skill baked in this game, but this game exists because people overestimate their edges. They forget certain losses, they remember all of their wins, and then it's funny because as soon as you start learning a little bit, you start realizing like how little you truly understand about this game. Then all of a sudden your brain does the opposite. You remember like 0 of the wins and you only remember the pain, and all of a sudden you have this new mental thing you have to work through. So it never stops. You're always in this ebb and flow. So be easy on yourself, and if some of the stuff that we're talking about today seems like overload, you're like, there's no way I could think about all this while playing. Like, I promise you, you're going to be able to. It'll just take a little bit of time. And if you can't get all of it today, then try to add a piece of it. Try to add a question that you can ask yourself. And if that's failing, then try to explore a hand off table and ask that question there, and try to do your best to estimate it. Just by asking the questions, just by thinking about the right things, you get better at, 1, making it more automatic, and 2, understanding what you need in order to develop answers there. Are you going to be wrong? Yes. Are you going to make terrible, terrible decisions from time to time? Yes. Are you going to lose some buy-ins? Yes. And that's baked into the equation. Don't panic about that. Just focus on making better decisions when you can and understanding what you need to understand between sessions so that in real time, things at least are a little bit easier and you're focused on the right stuff.
Yeah, the planes acronym is actually the perfect metaphor for the interplay of all these things. You don't get into a cockpit and just start flying the plane. You got to learn how to land and, autopilot and, the altimeters and the various readouts. And once you put that all together, you can fly the plane, but until you know how to put those things together, maybe it's best to stay at home, simulate, play a few games here and there to get some input. And so let's land this plane. Let's land this plane on SPR, and that's something that we've talked about in previous podcasts. It stands for stack to pot ratio, and it's really one of the foundational elements in poker strategy. So just, I guess, a brief overview on how it fits into planes.
So I won't turn this into a full SPR lesson. We do have a really great lesson on this baked into core. But if we think about SPR, what is it really focused on? It's focused on stack sizes and thinking about how those stack sizes are going to relate to the size of the flop pot. So by thinking about that, you start thinking about how much maneuverability, how much room you have to play things like drawing hands, or how committed you're going to be with things like top pair or over pairs. And it keeps you focused on the right stuff, because what happens is a lot of people play hands, especially in like multi-way pots, and they convince themselves like, okay, there's a lot of good drawing potential. Okay, but you're involved with like 4 other players, and all of a sudden the SPR is super small, and all of a sudden that ability to draw going post-flop goes very, very much out the window. And now this cool draw plan that you had, you realize, oh shoot, I now have to commit with a gut side of equity and probably no fold equity, and this sucks. But you have to, because that's what the math dictates at that point. Whereas you could have been proactive in that thought process pre-flop, and even though it looked deceptively pretty, you say, well, this isn't the greatest price, and the price isn't leading me to a great SPR, and what am I really hoping for, and how often is that really going to happen? And you might actually be able to fold some of these pots that get people into a lot of trouble. And that's one of those things. By being proactive, thinking about SPR inherently, you're baking stack depth into that, which is just kind of why I love focusing on SPR instead of just saying stack sizes, because you have to think about stack sizes and how they relate to SPR, because that's going to help you also plan for multi-way pots and not just think, oh, well, I have a deep stack so I can do whatever I want, because inherently I think my edge is great because I'm the best player that's ever been born and I'm going to beast every single table, right? Again, we need to like shave some of those layers out. And I don't think most of the people listening to this podcast are sitting here with that kind of mentality at all spots. But if you are, again, start shaving those layers off and stay focused on what truly matters, not just the overestimated edge.
Yeah. Well, this podcast continues to be humbling in that sense, where, it's fighting against that poker psychology of how great of a player I am. Every time I speak with you, I'm reminded of how much I have to learn. So thank you once again for explaining the planes concept. And we'll put a link to that in our show notes, redchippoker.com/S3, E4. Anything to add as we land the plane?
I love this. I didn't even really think about the idea of figuring out how to fly a plane when I created the acronym. It just kind of all the letters were there. I'm like, yeah, that works. Okay, that's fine. That's what we're going to use here. In fact, it originally was plan, PLAN, and then over time I added the ES, and I'm like, okay, this feels better. And just to be clear, we could definitely add more to this, but these are like the big foundational pieces where if you want to get away from just using a static range chart, like this is the stuff that you need to be focused on. These will point you in the right direction and help you deviate correctly from those charts. Again, either by being tighter or looser. But to the planes analogy, like I love that because you not only need to know how to fly it, you also need to know how to handle it while you're in air, and you also need to know how to land it. Because that's the thing. You could, take over a plane mid-flight, but if you can't land the damn thing, like, it's going to suck. This is not going to be a good flight. And it's the exact same thing in poker. If you get started on the wrong foot pre-flop, post-flop is going to be nightmarish. Like, you're going to find yourself in so many spots. You're going to lose so many extra pots that you shouldn't be losing because you shouldn't have really even been involved in them. And again, none of this is to say that you're going to win 100% of the pots that you get involved in, even if you make great pre-flop decisions. It's more trying to set up for getting involved in as many good spots as possible and also deleting all the bad spots that are just completely bleeding your win rate at the end of the day. And worse, are kind of tough to identify sometimes because they're smaller and maybe you're folding on a little bit on flops. I know we talked about this on a previous podcast, but by adding too many hands into your pre-flop stuff, you can find yourself over folding post-flop or over c-betting post-flop, and these things can add up in a really negative way. So again, add the good stuff, delete the bad stuff, and hopefully your pre-flop life gets much, much better, and your post-flop life inherently gets all the more profitable.
Awesome. Well, again, I encourage everyone, all of our listeners, to visit redchippoker.com/S3E4 to get this entire article. Start working on your pre-flop checklist. Thanks again to James. And until we see you next time, be good.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. But don't stop learning now. Head over to redchippoker.com. You'll find everything you need to get better today. Join our free, friendly strategy group and start talking poker with our coaches and community. And listen, if you're ready to take poker more seriously, sign up for Core, our $5 a week complete training platform built for players who have limited time to study. Core is packed with over 100 bite-sized lessons from the fundamentals to advanced strategies, quizzes, achievements, discussion threads, and more. And for the bravest of heart, we invite you to check out our pro membership, which includes 24/7 access to hundreds of videos, all of our playlists, all of our crash courses, and more. If you want to see what the top 1% of players are studying to keep their edges razor sharp, visit redchippoker.com/Ruby. That's RUBY, and get a special deal on your first 3 weeks. Until next time, run good, play better, and get there.